A hunter's boot broke the crust of leaves and the ground exhaled. His flashlight reached into that breath down 8 feet of darkness and found a chalk-pale wall, soft limestone smudged by damp, where someone had scratched a sentence with the tip of a knife. The letters weren't clean. They wavered, but they held. In that quiet, the stone looked like a message board meant for no one and everyone at once. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I've lived on Maple Street long enough to know it sounds by season. In May, the neighborhood wakes with cardinals on the telephone wire, the hum of a distant mower, and the hollow thunk of the morning paper hitting every third driveway. Back then, in '97, I'd be up before the sun out of habit, drinking coffee at the kitchen window, counting the porch lights, winking off one by one. Mine was usually the last to go dark, and the Hendersons' 2 houses down with the white shutters was usually the first. Michael left for the park by 6 most days, and Linda's sedan followed soon after, coffee steam drifting out the window as she rolled through the stop sign like every teacher on a tight bell schedule. Sarah and Emily grew up under those routines, and you could see it in the way they moved girls who understood time and weather without checking a clock. They'd jog past my place in mismatched socks with their bootlaces looped around their necks, laughing about who'd forgotten the iodine tablets or whose pack weighed a ton it never did. If I was tinkering in my garage, they'd stop to pet my old Beagle Lucky and ask if I had any extra bungee cords. I always did. The cords came back coiled neatly, and sometimes there'd be a drawing tucked under my doormat ferns and milkweed in pencil, a note from Emily in tidy print, Mr. Ellison. Do you know the name of this plant? I'd write Jack in the Pulpit on an index card and stick it to their mailbox with painter's tape. The next day, the card would be gone memorized, no doubt added to the catalog they were building in their heads. Michael liked to say the woods raise you in the small ways patience, listening how to place your feet. He and I spent enough hours in canoes to argue over lures without saying much else, and he'd grin when the conversation slid toward the girls. Sarah's got my stubborn, he'd tell me, pleased and half worried. Emily's got eyes like her mother. She can spot a red-tailed hawk at 60 miles an hour. On Friday evenings, you could hear their screen door slap and the voices layer in the kitchen, Linda chopping Sarah, ticking through a gear list, Emily reading off a weather forecast. It was a household that handled the woods the way a mechanic handles an engine, confident, methodical, with respect. I remember the scent of their garage, that spring sun-warmed nylon, a faint tang of camp fuel canvas that had dried after a careful rinse. They'd laid out their packs on a moving blanket to protect them from the oil stains. Sarah marked her compass case with a strip of white tape and her initials in black Sharpie. Emily counted water purification tablets into a film canister and shook it once to hear the dry rattle. It sounded like a pocketful of seashells. On the pegboard behind them hung coil after coil of paracord, a ranger's neatness. Everything had its spot. Saturday mornings I'd drive my pickup to the hardware store off Route 15, and at the light by the bakery I could see the ridge through the gaps in town green rising rock teeth bright where the sun caught them. The Appalachian Trail runs that spine like a zipper. Around here, folks talk about the AT the way other towns talk about the stadium. It's part of the backdrop trail, crews swapping stories at the diner, teenagers in prom attire, taking photos near a white blaze through hikers with their faraway look stocking up on peanut butter at the corner market. By May, everything smells like rain and thawed soil, and energy runs under the sidewalks like a river you can't see. Linda's classroom looked exactly how you'd expect for a high school biology teacher with a tidy streak. Posters of leaves, a glass terrarium glowing like a tiny swamp, a hand-lettered sign over her desk. Pay attention to small things. They tell you the truth first. She'd hand me an extra copy of a field guide she was retiring and shake her head when I tried to pay her for it. Give it to someone who will use it, she'd say, meaning one of the girls. At open house that spring, she laughed about a quiz question she'd misworded. They caught me, she said. Both of them, together, like they have one good brain they share. There was pride in that laugh and relief. The world felt orderly in those exchanges, like a plot you could follow. I keep a little ledger by our landline, names, numbers, quick notes from past searches. I started it years ago when I joined the volunteer team. You'd think it would be full of emergencies, and it is. But there are softer things in there, too. Mrs. K brought muffins to base camp. Lost hiker found at stream bend, 3:12 p.m. The point of logging those details is simple, so you remember that good weather isn't luck, and bad weather isn't doom. You prepare, you listen, you adjust. That's what Michael taught his girls, and that's what they learned. The week before their trip, Linda and my wife Carol stood at the edge of our yards comparing peonies over the low chain-link fence. They talked about lunches and end-of-year grading and how fast children become taller than the door frames you mark them on. Across the grass, a sprinkler hissed. Emily sat on their front step lacing a boot with slow concentration tongue between her teeth. A brown journal rested beside her thigh. She lifted it and wrote something, then glanced toward the sky like the words needed room. Sarah was in the driveway loading the Forerunner with the matter-of-fact attention of someone who knew precisely how a trunk should be packed. She slid a first aid kit into the side pocket of a pack and pressed down until the zipper's teeth met. I watched from my porch, and it felt like any other Friday in a safe neighborhood in a decent town. I've been in storms that taught me how quiet can be loud. The day before they left, clouds came through like a sweep on the bottom of a broom, only parting by late afternoon. Michael and I strung a line between the maple trees to dry a tarp, and Linda set 2 folding chairs in the shade and told us to sit a minute. She poured lemonade into cloudy plastic cups and asked me how the utility crew was handling the early heat. "Fine," I said, "as long as the transformers don't complain." Sarah waved while she walked past with a bundle of tent poles, and Emily looked up from that journal just long enough to say, "Mr. Ellison, how far do you think a hawk can see?" I gave her a number and then a better one, and she grinned like I'd let her in on a secret. Maps covered their dining table that evening, thin paper taped at the seams, little pencil crosses where water ran. Sure, even in August, small notes. Good view avoid after rain camp here flat. I stepped inside to return a socket wrench Michael had lent me, and he was standing over those sheets with a ruler laid along a contour line. "They've done their homework," he said. "No brag in it, only the satisfaction you get when all the tools are in the right drawer." On the counter, a Ziploc bag held a stack of quarters and crisp dollar bills for payphones, because not every ridge gives you a signal, and some habits hang around for a reason. Saturday before dawn, I saw their porch light bloom through my curtains. I took my mug to the front steps and listened to the house unwinding water in the pipes, a drawer closing gently, the back door bumping against a knee. The air was 52 degrees Celsius and smelled like wet mulch and lilac. A robin shouted its one loud note from the walnut tree. Linda stepped out with a pan of scrambled eggs held in a dish towel and set it on the picnic table under their carport. She moved quietly as if any sudden noise might spook good fortune. When the girls came down, Michael had folded a weather printout into halves, then quarters until it fit his wallet old ranger habits. They loaded the Forerunner with the focus you see on mornings when people are going somewhere they want to be. No wasted steps, no last-second drama. Sarah touched each strap and buckle as if introducing them to the day. Emily slung her bright blue pack and bounced once on her toes to settle it against her spine. I called down the sidewalk. "Bring back that bungee cord," and Sarah gave me a salute with 2 fingers. Linda paused at the driver's door and looked at her daughters like she was taking a photograph with her eyes. It was one of those glances you don't think you'll ever remember, and then you do because of everything that came after. I had errands to run. I let their taillights fade toward the park and went to the hardware store, then to the feed mill for dog food, because Lucky wouldn't forgive me otherwise. The day warmed to the low 70s, clear as a washed glass, and the ridge stood out like a shoulder of sleeping stone. Back home, I mowed the lawn in neat east-west lines and edged the walk. Late afternoon shadows made the neighborhood look like a picture you could slide into a frame. Carol set out 2 chairs by our hydrangeas, and we sat there with our shoes off. She asked if I'd heard from the crew about next week's pole replacements, and I said I hadn't. We didn't talk about the girls because there was nothing to talk about. They were where they wanted to be, and everything was as it should be. Evening in our town arrives with the same handful of notes, the ice cream truck's lullaby 3 blocks over, a screen door clapping twice a dog's tag chiming against a metal bowl. I could smell someone's charcoal, that sweet mix of briquettes catching and lighter fluid getting its last say. By habit, I turned on the Pirates game low on the radio in the garage, sound trailing out into the yard like a ribbon. At 7:30, the sun dropped behind the ridge and the maples threw lace onto the pavement. I looked down the street and saw the Henderson porch light come on again. It was early for it, only a little dusk. Linda liked to be ready. They had a system for trips. Call at 8 to say all is well, call again if plans shift, call sooner if anything made your neck hairs lift. We'd all laughed about it once, the girls calling from a payphone outside a country store with a farmer in line behind them, tapping his boot, Sarah trying to be efficient, Emily apologizing to the farmer in that earnest way of hers. A system isn't superstition. It's respect for uncertainty. 8 o'clock is a reasonable hour to ask for a voice. By 8, I'd put away the mower and stacked the clippings bag in the shed to dry. The radio murmured about someone's batting average. Streetlights hummed to life one by one, and moths began their slow orbit around the bulbs. I poured a second cup of coffee I didn't need and stood at the kitchen sink watching that small square of the world framed by my window. The Hendersons' front steps, the geranium in Linda's rail box, the welcome mat with a print of a trout on it. From where I stood, I could see part of their living room through the lace curtain, a blue couch, a lamp with a pull chain, a picture of the girls at Hawk Mountain from last fall. The phone on our wall ticked softly as it cooled from the day's use, a sound you only notice when you're listening for another one. At 8:05, you could pass the time on a breath. At 8:10, you find a chore to do so you don't look like you're counting. I dried the dinner plates and set them in the cabinet, careful not to clack them. Carol asked if the coffee was fresh. I said it was. Outside, a car rolled by, slow, the driver checking addresses with his dome light on. From the ridge, a barred owl called, and the sound fell into the street like water poured from a height. I looked again at that porch light 2 houses down. It held steady, a small circle on concrete, and no footsteps crossed it. By 8:15, the hour had that stretched feeling familiar to anyone who has ever waited for a ring that doesn't come. The neighborhood, so sure of itself an hour earlier, seemed to lean forward and listen with us. The porch light on Maple Street burned a little brighter against the dark, and the air cooled enough to raise the hair along my forearms. I told myself a signal can fade on a ridge, that payphones eat quarters, that good plans sometimes run a half hour late. I set my coffee down and turned the radio off. The house went quiet in the way a house does when it's paying attention, and I stood there, hand on the counter, looking at that square of light on their steps, waiting for a sound that still hadn't come. It was sometime after 8:30 when the light on the Hendersons' porch began to bother me, not because it was on, but because it stayed that way. Linda was punctual about everything, right down to switching that bulb off once the girls called to say they'd made camp. By 9, it was still burning steady as a watch face, and the street had gone quiet except for the wind combing through the maples. I remember standing at my kitchen window, the coffee long cold in my hand, trying to convince myself there was a simple reason for the silence. Maybe they'd found a bad signal. Maybe they'd turned in early. Maybe that bright little light meant nothing at all. But I'd worked enough searches to know what it feels like when the air changes, when waiting turns into something heavier. I told myself not to call, not yet. But around midnight, I heard the Hendersons' screen door open. The porch light shifted as Michael stepped out, cell phone pressed to his ear. Then again, a few minutes later, the sound of their front door opening wider, more footsteps, a murmur, then quiet. I knew then it had begun. By morning, the world had a different weight to it. Clouds hung low over the ridge, the kind that dull sound and stretch time. I walked down the block before the paper landed, met Michael halfway to his driveway. He looked like he hadn't slept. His ranger's jacket was zipped to his throat even though it was 60 degrees. No word I asked. He just shook his head. Phones go straight to voicemail, he said. They'd never... He didn't finish. Linda stood by the car, one hand clutching her thermos, the other pressed flat to her chest as if she were holding herself together. She gave a small nod when our eyes met. I didn't have to be asked. I told them I'd head to the park with him. By 5:30, the Toyota's tires were whispering over wet pavement heading north toward Pine Grove Furnace. When we reached the ranger station, the lot was half full already. 2 state police cruisers, a forestry truck, and a pickup I recognized from the volunteer rescue team. The early light slid through mist in thin gray threads. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and damp uniforms. Captain Morrison from the state police stood behind a folding table lined with maps, his hand flat over one. He looked up when we entered and gave the kind of nod that says, "We're moving, but we don't know where yet." Michael filled them in departure time, route-planned campsites, the 8 o'clock call that never came. He spoke like a man building a bridge out of words steady but trembling beneath. The officers asked for description gear, colors, clothing, the make of their hiking boots, and I noticed how Linda's hand stayed tight around the thermos as if she couldn't let it go. By sunrise, the first team was on the trail. I joined the second, the one sweeping north from the parking lot toward Center Point Knob, where the girls had planned to spend their first night. The forest was still wet from morning dew, everything gleaming. You could smell the crushed ferns where we stepped, that cold mineral scent that always makes you think of distance. We called their names, waited for an echo, called again. Nothing. Just the slow drip of water off the leaves. About an hour in, we passed 2 hikers coming from the opposite direction. Retirees from Maryland who remembered seeing 2 young girls with bright packs the previous morning. They'd been smiling, eating sandwiches near an overlook. It was a small relief proof they'd made it that far. By late morning, we reached that overlook ourselves. The view opened into the Cumberland Valley green fields. Thin ribbons of road, the Susquehanna flashing far off like a mirror. The air carried that damp chill that clings to the ridge after a storm. One of the troopers crouched near the rocks, pointing to the ground where the dirt was still disturbed. There were crumbs, a torn scrap of plastic wrap caught between stones, and 2 sets of prints leading away. Michael leaned over the impressions and whispered, "That's Sarah's tread pattern. Merrill boots, same as mine." He said it softly, like it hurt to know, and helped at the same time. The prints didn't follow the main trail. They turned west down toward an old logging road almost overgrown with laurel. The path looked harmless at first, wide enough for a truck wheel, ruts barely visible beneath the grass, but it ran the wrong way off the official maps. The captain called for a dog team to start there, and we pushed on another half-mile before the forest thickened and visibility dropped. You could feel it then, the unease. The air seemed denser, as if the woods were holding its breath. Back at the base that afternoon, the command post had grown into something resembling a small town. Tents went up for equipment. Volunteers arrived with sandwiches and coffee. Helicopters swept overhead in slow, methodical grids. Reporters had started to gather at the edge of the lot, their camera lights flickering against the rain-spotted windshields. Linda sat at a picnic table under the shelter, answering questions about the girls' experience, her voice thin but clear. Every few minutes she'd look up at the radio chatter coming from the command trailer. Short bursts of numbers, coordinates, silence. The first dog team returned after dark mud caked up to their knees. The handler shook his head before the captain even asked. Picked up a trail for a mile or so, he said. Then it loops back, loses strength near a creek bed. The rain started shortly after. It came down hard enough to erase Prince's washout scent. We stood there watching the water run down the length of the map pinned to the hood of a cruiser. Michael stared at that sheet of plastic as though he could will his daughter's route into focus. Over the next 2 days, the search spread across 40 square miles. Crews checked every trail, every abandoned cabin and deer stand. The National Guard sent 2 helicopters fitted with infrared sensors, but the canopy was too dense. From above, it was just one endless green roof. On the ground, we worked in pairs, shouting their names until our voices rasped. Sometimes we thought we heard a reply, a faint echo carried by wind, but it was never more than the forest throwing sound back at us. On Monday afternoon, a small piece of blue fabric was found snagged on a thorn bush along that same logging road. It matched the color of Emily's bandana. The cloth was fresh, no sign of weathering. For a moment, hope flared through the entire camp. The captain marked the coordinates, ordered a full sweep of the area, and teams fanned out in tight grids. We moved slower now, scanning every hollow and gully, expecting at any moment to hear a call, see movement, something. But the woods stayed still. By nightfall, the only sound was the generators humming at the command post and the soft murmur of volunteers, too tired to talk above a whisper. Linda stayed at the ranger station that night, her eyes red but focused, scribbling notes as if keeping a record could hold back despair. I caught a glimpse of Michael outside, standing alone by the tree line. The rain had eased to a mist, and his flashlight beam was trembling against the fog. "She taught them right," he said when I walked up beside him. "They wouldn't panic. They'd stay put. We'll find them." His words were meant for both of us, but neither of us sounded sure. By midweek, the weather turned colder. Temperatures dropped into the 30s and the ridges filled with low clouds. Search dogs still caught faint traces along the logging road, but lost them again near a series of shallow ravines. It was as if the trail folded over itself, circles of scent confusion fragments. They were moving. One handler told me quietly, but something made them double back. He looked away before adding, "Could be disorientation. Could be injury." Nobody wanted to finish that thought. Each night, the parking lot emptied a little sooner. Volunteers had to return to work families' lives waiting on the other side of the mountain. But Michael never left. Neither did I. We walked until our boots were slick with mud, until our flashlights threw weak yellow cones onto trees that all looked the same. By Thursday, the official count of man-hours topped 3,000. The captain called a meeting at dusk, his voice steady but edged with fatigue. "We're not giving up," he said, "but we're shifting focus." That phrase, shifting focus, hung in the air like smoke. It meant scaling back. It meant the search was now an investigation. I remember watching Linda when they told her. She didn't cry. She just folded the map she'd been holding and placed it neatly on the table, then stood up and walked outside into the rain. Michael followed his arm around her shoulders. I stayed where I was, listening to the rain tapping the roof of the tent. The sound was soft, but relentless, the way grief can be when it hasn't yet realized it's permanent. In the weeks that followed, the mountain grew quiet again. The flyers faded on bulletin boards, their corners curling in the weather. Summer came, then fall. I still hiked parts of that trail, sometimes with other volunteers, sometimes alone. There were days when I swore I could hear a faint echo of their laughter in the wind, the way Emily's voice rose when she got excited, or how Sarah used to hum under her breath while checking her compass. It wasn't ghosts. It was memory lodged in the air like pollen. Years went by and the world moved on. New hikers came through, new stories took over the news. But for those of us who lived on Maple Street, time stayed caught in that first weekend of May. The Henderson house remained the same white shutters, the same porch light, though it rarely burned past midnight anymore. Every spring, Linda hung 2 sets of wildflower baskets on the rail, one blue, one green. She said it felt wrong to hang only one. I learned that grief, like the forest, has its own geography ravines, where the light never reaches sudden clearings that appear without warning. You think you're through it. Then something shifts, a song on the radio, a map folded the same way, and you're back in the thick of it. That's how it was with the Hendersons and with all of us who searched. We never stopped walking that ridge in our heads, tracing and retracing every possible route, looking for the one turn that might have changed everything. 12 years is a long time for a silence to last, but it did. The trail healed over rain, softened the prints we once followed, and moss covered the rocks where we'd sat to rest. Then, one afternoon in October of 2009, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end wasn't. It was Ray Martinez, the detective who'd taken over the case years before. His tone was calm, deliberate, the way you speak when news has weight. "Frank," he said, "I think we found them." He gave no details, just coordinates near the old timber tract west of the park. Hunters had stumbled on something a space beneath the ground, a discovery that didn't fit the landscape. I felt the room tilt a little as I wrote down the numbers. Outside, the evening light was thin, the kind that makes every color look washed and every sound sharper. I hung up, sat still for a long time, and listened to the silence settle again. It was the same silence from that first night, the one that started with a porch light and a phone that didn't ring. Only this time, it wasn't waiting for an answer. It was carrying one. I sat there a long while after that call, the receiver still warm in my hand. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet you rest in. It was the kind that hums waiting for whatever comes next. Ray's words circled back, steady and unreal. "I think we found them." I'd heard that phrase 100 times in my years volunteering, but never about people I'd watched grow up. Outside, dusk had dropped over the ridge like a blanket pulled too low the sky, that strange shade of steel blue that lives only in October. I remember reaching for my jacket before I even knew where I was going. The drive to the site took just under an hour. My truck's headlights carved 2 narrow paths through fog that clung low to the asphalt. The coordinates Ray had given me led toward a patch of private timberland west of the park, an area I knew mostly by name. It had been logged decades back then, forgotten, left to grow wild again. Folks hunted there, but few ever hiked it. The road narrowed the deeper I went, gravel giving way to dirt, then to something that barely passed for a trail. A few hundred yards in, I saw the lights flashing blue and amber against the trees, reflecting off mist. When I pulled up, I could already tell it was serious. You can read a scene by the posture of the people around it. No idle chatter, no curious glances. Just that heavy focus that settles when a discovery shifts from curiosity to certainty. I parked behind a state trooper's SUV and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled like wet bark and diesel. A generator hummed somewhere ahead, feeding a set of floodlights that threw the woods into harsh contrast, bright white patches and deep swallowing shadows. Ray met me at the tape line. His hair had gone gray at the temples since I'd last seen him, but his voice was the same, measured, deliberate, trying not to carry the weight of what it knew. "2 hunters were tracking a deer," he said quietly. "One of them went through a weak patch of ground. There's a cavity underneath natural, maybe part of a sinkhole. They found remains." He didn't have to say whose. We followed a narrow path down to the site boots, sinking into the spongy leaf bed. Every few feet, a piece of flagging tape fluttered in the flashlight beams. The earth dipped into a shallow bowl where the floodlights had been angled downward. From above, it looked like a wound in the ground about 6 feet wide, rimmed with wet soil and broken branches. Investigators were kneeling near the edge, speaking in low tones, their gloved hands careful as surgeons. The air inside the hollow was still almost stale, carrying the faint metallic scent of decay that the years hadn't quite erased. I stayed back while Ray briefed the team. A young trooper shined her light across the opening, revealing what looked like the curve of a metal frame twisted and dull with age. The sight of it hit harder than I expected. It was a backpack frame aluminum, the kind that had gone out of style in the late 90s. Even from 20 feet away, I recognized the color. One green, one blue. They moved slow. The evidence techs lowered a small camera rig into the cavity, snapping photo after photo before anyone touched a thing. Then came the measured hands clearing debris, lifting items in sequence. I watched a fragment of fabric appear a piece of nylon no bigger than a glove, followed by what looked like the corner of a map case. Each object was tagged, placed in a bag labeled. There was no rush. Everyone knew time had already done its worst. When they found the remains, the forest seemed to stop breathing. I don't know how else to describe it. Even the rain that had been spitting on the leaves went silent for a moment. One of the investigators stood eyes glassy in the harsh light and gave Ray a single nod. No words passed. There didn't need to be. Later, when the forensics van arrived, I stepped aside to let them through. My flashlight caught a reflection in the mud, something small, rectangular, half buried under a layer of leaves. I knelt and brushed it free. It was a metal pencil case, the cheap kind kids carried in the 90s with a little clasp on the front. The paint had mostly peeled, but I could still make out a faint engraving on the corner EH. I handed it to one of the evidence techs, and she looked at me with the same quiet recognition. Emily Henderson. By the time the coroner finished his preliminary sweep, the night had deepened. The temperature dropped fast. You could see everyone's breath hanging in the light. They secured the area and began the long process of extraction. I watched as the first bag rose from the hollow, handled with a reverence that only comes from people who understand what it means to close a circle. When they finally stepped back, the lead anthropologist, Dr. Hartman, took a moment before speaking. "We'll know more once we get them to the lab," she said softly, "but based on condition and artifacts. This is consistent with the time frame we've been looking at." Her words carried no satisfaction, only gravity. Ray called the Hendersons around 8 that night. He asked me to stay close in case they needed someone familiar to bridge the silence. I listened as he spoke, gentle, factual, unflinching. Linda's voice cracked once on the other end, then steadied. Michael didn't say a word for a long time. When he did, it was only, "Thank you." Over the next few days, the site was sealed and catalogued piece by piece. The cave, or what turned out to be a shallow rock shelter, was mapped, measured, and photographed from every angle. I went back once, with permission, standing at the edge where the soil had given way. From up close, you could see how impossible it would have been to spot from above. Decades of leaves and fallen limbs had disguised it perfectly. The entrance sat just 200 yards from the old logging road where we'd walked countless times in '97. 200 yards. That number stuck in my throat like a stone. Inside, they found the sisters' packs still zipped and mostly intact. Sarah's green one held a compass, a roll of gauze, a small flashlight with corroded batteries. Emily's blue pack contained her journal, sealed in a waterproof bag that had done its job all those years. They said the handwriting grew shakier with each entry, the ink fading toward the end. Her last words were addressed to her parents. I didn't read them, but Ray told me later that they spoke of hope, how they could hear helicopters, how they believed rescue was close. The report that came back from the lab was heartbreak, dressed in science. Sarah had suffered a compound fracture in her leg from the initial fall. Infection set in. Emily had a head injury likely from rockfall when she climbed down after her sister. Trapped in that pocket of earth, they'd rationed what little they had waiting for the searchers who'd passed almost directly above them. They survived for days, maybe more than a week. Then the cold and the injuries did what time always does. It took what was left. When I visited the Hendersons after the identification was confirmed, their house looked unchanged. Same curtains, same framed photo of the girls smiling beside a trail sign. But the air was different. Not heavy anymore, just still. Linda met me at the door, eyes rimmed red but clear. "We know now," she said quietly. "That's something." Michael sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers before him. Maps, notes, the original search records. "They were right there, Frank," he murmured. "All that time. Right there." I didn't know what to say, so I just sat with them, the three of us, listening to the house creak as the heater kicked on. The following spring, the Park Service placed a marker near the trailhead. Simple bronze plaque, their names engraved beneath a line from Emily's journal. "Tell Mom and Dad we love them." I was there the day they set it. Sunlight broke through the trees just as they tightened the bolts. The forest looked almost gentle again, the way it had before all of this began. Hikers passed, reading the plaque quietly before moving on. Some left wildflowers, others just touched the metal and kept walking. In the months that followed, the state reviewed the search protocols. Ground-penetrating radar became standard. New mapping software integrated underground features. They even started distributing emergency beacons to long-distance hikers. Every advancement felt like progress and regret stitched together. We all knew if that technology had existed in '97, Sarah and Emily would have been found within hours. Ray and I stayed close during that time, talking through the paperwork and the public reports. He told me how the discovery had shaken some of the younger officers, how they couldn't stop replaying the what-ifs. "It's hard to accept that sometimes you can do everything right," he said, "and still not reach them. I think about that a lot. How even the best efforts can bend under the weight of bad luck and hidden ground. The forest doesn't play by our rules. It keeps what it wants until it's ready to return it. And when it finally does, it's rarely in the way we expect." The cave was sealed after the investigation closed. They filled it with clean soil, set a small granite marker at the site. I went back one last time before they finished. The air was cool and sweet with pine, the sound of a distant stream barely carrying through the trees. I stood where the hunters had, where the earth had opened, and thought about how close we'd come back then, close enough to have walked right over them without knowing. As I left, I looked up toward the ridge where the main trail cut across the horizon. A pair of hawks circled overhead, riding the thermals. For a moment, it looked almost like the world was balanced again. But as I turned toward my truck, I caught sight of something small glinting in the mud near my boot. It was a shell casing, old tarnished, likely from one of the hunter's rifles, but it stopped me cold just the same. Because in that second, under that dim autumn light, I couldn't help feeling that the mountain was still holding secrets. That even with all we'd found, there might be more waiting beneath the surface, quiet and unseen. And that thought followed me down the road all the way home. I didn't sleep much after that night in the timber tract. When something like that resurfaces after so many years, the noise doesn't fade once you go home. It stays under your skin, the sound of shovels scraping rock. The camera flashes that breathless stillness right before the first body bag rises from the earth. I spent the next morning sitting on the back steps with my coffee going cold, watching fog drift over the yards on Maple Street. It was the kind that blurs edges, softens lines, makes the world look almost merciful. For the first time in 12 years, I knew where Sarah and Emily were. But knowing doesn't always feel like peace. Sometimes it feels like standing on a bridge that's finally built, but you're too tired to cross. Ray called around noon to tell me the forensic team had opened the sealed bag they'd found inside one of the packs, the one that turned out to hold Emily's journal. He said it was in better condition than anyone expected. The waterproof sleeve had done its job. Most of the pages were legible, and the entries stretched days past when we'd stopped searching. They lasted longer than we thought, he told me. His voice caught on that last part the way voices do when a fact carries weight it doesn't deserve. I didn't ask to read it. It wasn't mine to touch. But he told me enough for the words to take shape anyway. Her descriptions of the dark, of trying to splint her sister's leg with a hiking pole and a belt of hearing helicopters overhead and believing help was a few hours away. Then the handwriting faltered, slanting across the page until it broke off mid-sentence. When the lab released its findings, the picture filled in piece by piece. The cave had been hidden beneath a false floor of leaves and branches that had accumulated over decades. Sarah had fallen first, breaking her leg on impact. Emily must have climbed down after her, dislodging more rock and partially sealing them inside. They had food for a few days, water for a little longer. They rationed, waited, and listened. From the outside, the searchers would have walked right over that spot close enough to speak without ever hearing a reply. That thought still sits heavy with me. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it, like an echo of a sound I didn't catch in time. Michael and Linda came out to the site 3 days later, once the coroner finished. The area was taped off the ground, reseeded where the excavation had ended, but you could still see the rawness of it, fresh soil against old, the edges of a wound not yet healed. Linda stood with her hands clasped in front of her eyes, fixed on the space, as though she were trying to see through time. Michael stayed a few steps back, his jaw, tight shoulders, squared like he was bracing for impact. "They weren't lost," Linda said quietly. "They knew exactly where they were. We just couldn't see them." No one answered. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound like noise against the kind of truth that simple. The memorial service came a few weeks later. The air had that brittle edge of early winter, cold enough to turn breath, visible, but not enough to snow. The church was full. People I hadn't seen in years came, some from hours away. The girls' old classmates, now grown and carrying kids of their own. Rangers, hikers, volunteers from that spring in '97. The Hendersons chose a joint casket side by side, their names carved into one slab of granite, together in life, together in eternity. I remember the sound of Linda's voice when she spoke at the podium, calm, steady, not a tremor. "They loved these mountains," she said, "and I won't let those mountains take that love from me." Afterward, Ray and I stood outside the church near the line of parked cars. He looked older that day, the kind of older that comes from years of unanswered questions that suddenly find their ending. "It's strange," he said, "how closure doesn't really close anything. It just shifts the shape of the open space." He was right. It doesn't heal. It just changes the kind of ache you carry. The next months passed in a blur of reports and reviews. The state wanted to know what could have been done differently, what blind spots in 1997 had left two bright, capable girls unseen for so long. They combed through old maps, analyzed radio logs, compared search patterns. The conclusion was hard but honest. No one had failed. The tools simply hadn't existed. Back then, GPS was a luxury, ground-penetrating radar was experimental, and cell coverage was luck on a good ridge. The lesson wasn't about blame, it was about evolution, and somehow that distinction mattered. By spring, the area around Pine Grove Furnace had changed. New signs went up at trailheads, clear warnings about unmarked roads, about the risks of venturing off-trail. The Park Service installed emergency beacons in high-traffic sections, bright orange boxes bolted to trees with instructions printed in plain language. Every time I hiked past one, I thought of Emily's last entry, how she wrote about hearing searchers nearby and wondering why they couldn't see her. Those boxes would have changed everything. Michael poured his grief into something tangible. He worked with outdoor retailers to create a program that lent GPS beacons to hikers free of charge. "If we can make it easy," he said, "people will use them." He spent weekends teaching trail safety workshops, standing in front of community centers with diagrams and worn maps explaining how to plan routes and leave breadcrumb signals for rescuers. It was his way of giving the story back to the world, shaped into something useful. Linda went a different route. She started a scholarship in the girls' names funding wilderness safety training for high schoolers. Each spring, she'd visit the winning class, telling them about her daughters with a gentleness that could quiet any room. I attended one of those presentations a few years later. She stood beneath a projection of the Appalachian Trail, the kind of map her girls used to tape across their bedroom wall. "Safety isn't fear," she told the students. "It's respect. The forest doesn't owe you anything, but it'll meet you halfway if you're careful." I watched their faces, the same mix of restlessness and wonder I'd seen in Sarah and Emily. Some lessons don't die, they just find new listeners. Still, not everyone could let go as easily. Some of the old search and rescue volunteers came to see me during that first winter after the discovery. They talked about guilt, how close we'd been, how many times our boots had passed above that hidden chamber. One man said he dreamed of calling out and hearing a faint reply he'd somehow ignored. We talked late into the night about how the forest can play tricks on sound, how it bends and swallows echoes. Eventually, I told him what I'd come to believe, that we hadn't failed them. The mountain had simply held its silence until it was ready to speak. Sometimes that's all you can accept. In early 2010, I visited the sealed site again. The Park Service had placed a small bronze plaque at the location, simple and unadorned, in memory of Sarah and Emily Henderson, who loved these mountains and found peace here together. Someone had left a wildflower bouquet beside it, half frozen, but still bright against the dirt. I sat for a while, listening to the faint rush of a nearby creek, the kind of sound that fills the spaces between thoughts. I don't know how long I stayed, long enough for the sun to dip behind the ridge and turn the whole forest gold for a few fleeting minutes. As I walked back to my truck, I saw Jake Morrison, the hunter who'd made the discovery, standing near the trailhead with his brother. He nodded when he saw me and said I didn't do anything special, just stepped where the ground gave way. I told him that sometimes that's how truth works, it hides until someone stumbles into it. He didn't say much after that. He just looked out toward the tree line, quiet and heavy-eyed. In the years that followed, the story of the Henderson sisters spread far beyond Pennsylvania. Documentaries, articles, even wilderness training manuals used it as a case study. I worried at first that it would be sensationalized, but the Hendersons kept it grounded. Every interview, every public mention came back to the same point: education, preparation, respect for the wild. Linda once told me she didn't want her daughters remembered for how they died, but for how they lived. They loved the trail, she said. It's only right that it teaches now. I suppose that's what loss does when it's tended carefully. It turns pain into instruction. The scholarships grew, the safety programs expanded, and new technology kept hikers safer than ever before. I saw fewer search calls come through my pager each season, progress measured in quiet, invisible ways. Yet even with all that change, the mountain never lost its hold on me. Every time I hike those ridges, there's a stretch of silence that feels familiar, the kind of quiet that presses against your ribs, reminding you what the forest keeps. It's not haunting exactly. It's more like reverence. A reminder that some stories stay rooted in the ground, no matter how much we try to move past them. I still pass the Henderson house sometimes. The shutters are painted a softer color now, and the porch light, the one that once burned too long, shines just the same. Linda keeps it on at dusk, a soft beacon spilling over the steps. I think about that night in 1997 when I watched from my kitchen window, waiting for a phone that never rang. The years have rounded the sharp edges, but that light, steady and patient, still says what words can't. Not long ago, I hiked the section near where the old logging road used to cut west. It's closed off now, reclaimed by the forest. I stopped at the ridge, looking down toward where the cave had been sealed beneath layers of soil and root. The air smelled of pine and rain. Somewhere far off, a hawk called that high, lonely note that fades slower than you expect. I stood there until the wind shifted, bringing the faint scent of earth, and for a moment I thought I could hear laughter, soft, overlapping, carried just far enough to make me listen harder. Then it was gone. When I turned back toward the trail, The evening light had deepened, and a single ray cut through the trees, catching the plaque below like a whisper of fire. I took that as my cue to go. But before I did, I looked once more toward that hollow in the woods where two sisters had waited, and the rest of us had searched without seeing. The forest was quiet again, its secrets settled. Still, some part of me knew the story wasn't quite finished, that echoes like theirs don't fade. They just travel slower, circling back through time until someone else is listening. I didn't plan to go back up there again that spring. The ground was still soft, the kind that gives under your boots and carries the smell of rain even when the sky's been clear for days. But one Saturday morning, without really deciding, I found myself driving north along that same two-lane stretch that hugs the mountain. The trees were greening early that year, soft leaves shimmering against the gray trunks, the kind of new growth that makes you think the earth forgets faster than people do. I parked where the gravel shoulder widens and just sat a while, engine ticking as it cooled. The air was cool but not cold, and the only sound was the low hum of the wind moving through the ridge. It had been almost a year since the discovery, since Sarah and Emily had come home. The headlines had faded. The cameras were gone. The investigation files were closed and boxed up their edges, already gathering dust somewhere in the county archive. But for the rest of us, the ones who searched, the ones who waited closure, never quite came. It just softened into something quieter. Life went on in its small, steady way. Maple Street still woke up, the same mail truck rattling by at 10 sprinklers hissing against sidewalks, porch lights clicking on at dusk. The Hendersons still lived in their house with the white shutters, though they kept the curtains drawn now not in secrecy, but in peace. I started walking the old trail again a few times a month. Habit, I guess. Some people find their calm in church pews or fishing boats. Mine was in those woods. Every ridge and hollow held a memory of that search, the sound of voices calling names that never answered. But it wasn't the same kind of haunting anymore. It was gentler, almost companionable, like the mountain had learned to speak a softer language. I'd stop at the marker sometimes, trace my thumb along the bronze letters until my skin picked up the warmth of the metal. Someone, maybe Linda, kept fresh flowers there, always wild, never store-bought. Once a child's drawing had been taped to the base, 2 stick figures with backpacks, a sun overhead. No signature. Linda called me that summer to tell me about the scholarship winners. 2 high school seniors headed into environmental science, both from small towns not unlike ours. The girls would have liked them, she said. Her voice had that calm, grounded tone I'd come to know the kind people develop when they've been through the unthinkable and learned to keep breathing anyway. "We can't change what happened," she said, "but we can make sure someone learns from it." Michael didn't talk much on those calls. He'd answer, hand the phone to her, then go quiet in the background, the sound of a screen door closing somewhere behind him. I saw him one afternoon at the ranger station cleaning gear for one of his safety programs. He looked older, slower, but steady. We sat on the tailgate of his truck talking about small things, the weather, the deer population that year, the new trail signs the park had posted. Then, after a long pause, he said, "I keep thinking about that night they left. How normal it all was. I didn't know it could end like that." He rubbed his hands together, palms rough from years outdoors. "You never know the last time you'll see something right." I didn't have an answer for him, but I've thought about that sentence ever since. Ray retired not long after the case wrapped. We met for coffee once in Harrisburg before he moved south. He said the Henderson file was the one that stayed with him most, not because of the mystery, but because of the silence that followed it. Some cases end loud, he told me, stirring his cup, arrests, trials, cameras. Others end in a whisper. This one felt like the woods themselves gave the verdict. I asked if he ever went back to the site, and he shook his head. "No, I don't need to. We already heard what it had to say." For me, the story settled into the rhythm of the seasons. Each May, when the first real warmth touched the valley, I'd drive out past the park and walk until the road turned to gravel. I'd bring a thermos of coffee, sometimes a dog-eared copy of a map, as if the ritual needed props to feel complete. The mountain never looked the same twice, sometimes veiled in fog, sometimes clear enough to see the farthest ridges stacked like waves. Every now and then I'd catch myself listening, waiting for something I couldn't name. It wasn't for them exactly, more like for the faint reminder that time doesn't erase, it just lays another layer over the one before. When people ask what happened to the Henderson sisters, I tell them the truth, simple and spare. They went into the mountains they loved and didn't come out. They weren't reckless, they weren't careless. They were just human, caught between what they knew and what they couldn't predict. The earth shifted and they vanished beneath it. That's all. It's not the kind of story that satisfies curiosity, but it's the kind that teaches. We like to think the wilderness is something we conquer, but it's really something that tolerates us for a while, then reminds us who's in charge. Sometimes I think about that first night standing at my kitchen window watching the porch light on Maple Street burn too long. I didn't know it then, but that small light had already become a symbol of everything that followed. The waiting, the worry, the long, slow ache of not knowing. Linda still turns it on every night, just at dusk. She says it's habit. Maybe it is. Maybe it's something more. The light doesn't burn out, and neither do the memories that live behind it. As the years went on, the trail changed hands. New rangers came through, new hikers passed by. Most never knew the story, but a few did. I could tell by the way they'd pause near the marker, read the names, and stay a little longer than courtesy required. Some would leave stones, others a note tucked under the plaque. I once found a folded piece of paper damp from rain. It said, "For Sarah and Emily, who remind us to look closer." No signature, just those words. I left it there. The last time I saw Linda was at a community event in town, one of those small summer gatherings with lemonade tables and hand-painted signs. She was helping a group of students from the scholarship program. Her hair had gone white and she moved slower, but her eyes still had that same brightness. When she spotted me, she smiled. "You still hiking up there?" she asked. I nodded. "Good," she said. "Someone should keep an eye on the place." We talked a few more minutes before she was pulled into another conversation. As I watched her walk away, I realized how time had folded us all into the same rhythm of carrying and letting go. Now, when I tell this story, I don't dwell on the search or the science or even the loss itself. What stays with me is the sound of those woods, the steady pulse of life continuing after tragedy, the quiet proof that even in grief the world doesn't stop turning. I think about the small ways people remember a porch light, a trail marker, a scholarship, a cup of coffee shared between friends who've seen too much to pretend otherwise. Some nights when the air is still and the sky has that deep indigo before full dark, I'll step outside and listen. The wind moves through the trees in the same slow rhythm it did all those years ago. If you stand long enough, you start to feel the distance close, a reminder that time doesn't take everything with it. Some things it just carries forward, changing shape until they fit the silence better. What became of everyone? They lived. Not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. The Hendersons found purpose where there used to be pain. The town remembered quietly in its own way, and those of us who searched learned that rescue isn't always about finding people alive. It's about bringing them home, however long it takes. I think that's what this story really became, a homecoming. Not the kind marked by triumph or tears, but by peace. The kind that lets you stand in a place that once broke you and know it no longer can. The forest will always hold its secrets, but now, when I walk those trails, I don't feel the weight of unanswered questions. I feel gratitude that in the end the mountain gave them back. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views or clicks, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Tell someone about Sarah and Emily Henderson, two sisters who went into the woods and never truly left because as long as we keep saying their names, they're still part of the light that guides the rest of us home.